Imagine your quiet suburban neighborhood suddenly erupting into chaos when an HOA Karen points a loaded gun at an innocent woman during a petty dispute, only to be met with an unexpected turn of justice just seconds later. What would you do if your home, your family, and your safety were threatened by the very person meant to uphold community rules? Today, you're about to hear how one man turned the tables on a power-hungry neighbor who took things way too far. Before we dive into this unbelievable story of HOA drama, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss these jaw-dropping, real-life stories of community meltdowns. Let's get into it. It all started on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon in a neighborhood that looked peaceful from the outside, but had long been under the shadow of a domineering HOA board. The woman at the center of the storm was known as Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of every nitpicky rule written in the bylaws. She had a reputation for intimidation, from threatening letters taped on doors to verbal confrontations in the cul-de-sac. The homeowners whispered about her antics, but few dared to challenge her, fearing the endless fines and harassment she wielded like weapons. For my wife, it was just another day tending to the yard, watering flowers and enjoying the brief calm after weeks of tension. Karen had been circling our property, nitpicking about lawn lengths, driveway stains, and even the color of flower pots. But that day, something snapped. She stormed over, her eyes burning with rage, claiming that the flowers were not HOA approved. My wife tried to ignore her, focusing on her gardening, but the tension escalated quickly. Karen screamed louder, her hands gesturing wildly until finally she pulled something from her purse. To my wife's horror, it was a loaded handgun, small but unmistakable, and she raised it directly at her chest. In those terrifying seconds, the world seemed to freeze. Birds stopped chirping, the hum of traffic dulled, and my wife's breath caught in her throat. Karen's hand shook with fury and arrogance, convinced she had the authority to instill fear through sheer dominance. But what she didn't know was that I had just pulled into the driveway after work, stepping out of the car at the exact moment she brandished the weapon. My presence changed everything. I wasn't just a homeowner trying to live peacefully. I had training, discipline, and a background that Karen had no clue about. The scene was set for a clash that would reshape the neighborhood forever. The moments after I stepped into view were like an explosion of raw adrenaline and fear. Karen, caught off guard by my sudden appearance, hesitated but kept the gun pointed at my wife. Neighbors peeked through blinds, recording on phones, but nobody dared step outside. I instantly assessed the situation, years of instinct kicking in as I closed the distance between us. My voice stayed calm, my body steady, but inside I was raging. Karen had crossed the line from petty harassment to life-threatening violence. Every second felt like a razor's edge. If I moved too fast, she might fire, but if I moved too slow, she might gain the confidence to squeeze the trigger. My wife stood frozen, her eyes locked on mine, silently pleading for this nightmare to end. I remembered the countless times Karen had bullied others, but this was different. This wasn't about fines or bylaws anymore. This was about life and death. With precise timing, I lunged, my hand gripping her wrist and forcing the barrel away from my wife's chest. She shrieked, struggling, but my grip was unyielding. I twisted, and the weapon clattered to the pavement. Neighbors gasped, one even dropping their phone in shock as the confrontation unfolded. Karen clawed at me, spewing threats, but she was no match. I pinned her down with controlled force, ensuring she couldn't reach the weapon again. My wife rushed to safety, trembling but unhurt. The silence that followed was deafening until sirens pierced the air. Someone had called the police. When they arrived, Karen was still screaming, blaming us for everything, insisting she had every right to enforce HOA rules by any means necessary. The officers didn't buy it. They cuffed her, bagged the weapon, and took statements from half a dozen horrified witnesses. The HOA board rushed over soon after, their faces pale as they realized the liability they now faced. Karen wasn't just a nuisance anymore. She had become a criminal, and the board's tolerance of her antics had indirectly fueled her arrogance. But as Karen was taken away, spitting insults and promises of revenge, I knew this was far from over. Her grip on the neighborhood had been broken, but the aftermath would reveal just how deep her influence and connections went. This wasn't just the end of Karen. It was the beginning of a full-scale unraveling of the HOA itself. The days that followed were a blur of police reports, legal consultations, and hushed conversations among neighbors. Many who had been silent about Karen's reign of terror finally spoke up, sharing stories of threats, extortion, and intimidation. The police investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of complaints filed against her, all brushed aside by a complicit HOA board that had relied on her to enforce order with ruthless efficiency. But the exposure of her criminal act forced a reckoning. Lawsuits were filed, not just against Karen but against the HOA as an organization. Neighbors who had been too afraid to act were now emboldened by the fact that one person had stood up and survived. For me and my wife, the nightmare was far from over. Every day brought new rumors of Karen's connections, whispers that she had powerful allies within the county who might shield her from the worst consequences. But I was determined not to let fear take hold again. I doubled down, working with attorneys, attending HOA meetings, and documenting every irregularity. The board squirmed under the pressure, their carefully cultivated image crumbling as residents demanded accountability. And then, just when it seemed the storm might settle, a shocking twist emerged. Karen had been granted bail. She returned to the neighborhood, her presence like a poisonous cloud. She couldn't legally approach us, but her smug glares from across the street and veiled threats through mutual acquaintances kept the tension boiling. My wife lived in constant anxiety, and I knew this wasn't just about personal safety anymore. It was about ensuring justice was served and the community was freed from her grip once and for all. The battle lines were drawn. It was no longer just a fight against a rogue neighbor. It was a war against corruption, intimidation, and fear embedded within the very structure of the HOA. What began as a single terrifying confrontation with a gun had grown into a full-blown uprising, and I was determined to see it through to the end. The final chapter of this saga came crashing down with the force of a storm. Court proceedings stretched on for weeks, filled with testimonies, evidence, and emotional accounts from neighbors who had been victimized for years. One by one, people stood up, their voices shaking but resolute, painting a picture of a community terrorized by Karen's unchecked power. The prosecution laid out the case in brutal detail: unlawful possession of a firearm on HOA property, assault with a deadly weapon, and a history of harassment that escalated to the point of attempted violence. Karen's defense tried to spin the story, painting her as a misunderstood enforcer simply doing her duty, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. The jury didn't buy it. The verdict was clear: guilty. Karen's sentencing brought a wave of relief that swept through the neighborhood like a cleansing fire. She was no longer a looming shadow, but a cautionary tale of how far arrogance and unchecked power could fall. But it didn't end with her conviction. The HOA board, exposed for years of negligence, was dismantled. A new election was held, and for the first time in years, the community had a chance to rebuild without fear. For my wife and me, the journey had been exhausting, but we emerged stronger, no longer intimidated by bullies hiding behind titles or bylaws. Our neighbors, once silent and fractured, were now united, determined never to let another Karen rise unchecked again. The story of the loaded gun and the 5 seconds that changed everything became legend, whispered at barbecues and retold at community meetings, a reminder that courage in the face of tyranny could restore peace and justice. And as I looked out over our yard, my wife by my side, I knew that the neighborhood we fought for was finally free, and that, as how one man, his quick thinking and courage turned a terrifying HOA showdown into the downfall of a corrupt neighbor and board. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, And ring that notification bell so you don't miss more shocking tales of HOA drama and neighborhood justice.